All right, we are now joined on the Sharks Audio Network by my good friend Brody Brazil, now of the San Jose Sharks. We brought you in, Brody. Finally got sucked in. We got our clutches on you. I was joking, the other day that I was just saying, I was like, the broadcasters, we're all just slowly taking over the teams. I'm sure Jonathan Becker doesn't want to hear that, but we can tell everybody that those are the shadow puppets. We're really pulling all the strings up here.
I've always felt like you and I were teammates, even though maybe the paychecks didn't come from the same place. Now we are officially coworkers, teammates, brothers from another mother, all the above, Ted. So
Well, you've been the one guy
it's a
that I could
pleasure.
talk to about soldering material. Like, Brody, what do you think of the rosin cord that's still out there, or not out there, rather? So we had that going on. We could nerd out on that stuff together. And we've always been able to nerd out on sports. So now let's nerd out specifically on the San Jose Sharks.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. 10 goals in 2 games, 5 goals back to back, losing both of them. That was rather frustrating. Which one was more frustrating to you? The blown 5-1 lead, or the fact that they were able to come back from 3-0 and 5-2 deficits and still not walk away with a point?
Let's just not play Nashville again until at least March 11th. Oh, wait, no, that is the next game. I would say probably the first game. Going up 5-1, allowing the final 6 unanswered of the game. I think that was the more frustrating one because that was kind of a in-the-bag situation and a team with, I don't know, just a little bit, and I don't want to say they're immature, that's not it, but a team that's a little bit ahead of where the Sharks are at now. There's no way they blow that lead. There's no way that any type of comeback takes place. I think what we saw last home game where the Sharks were down by 3 goals early, first 7 minutes, made a comeback, almost had it tied by the end of the first period, but then eventually go down by 3 again, ultimately tied the game at 5. At least that was a competitive loss. What can you say about game 1 in the back-to-back with Nashville? That was one that got away. But at least game 2 of the series was a competitive loss. So I'm going to have to say game 1 was more frustrating. I think the bigger picture here, Ted, is if you were to look at the Sharks through the first 50 games of this year and the first 50 games of last season, the records are near identical.
Right.
Now, the outsider sees that and says, I don't know about much progress. But if you are somebody like you or I watching every game, you're like, this is a totally different season. This has a totally different feel. And it actually feels weird to look at the records and say, well, they're not that much different because so many things are different on a game-to-game basis. So I do see the growth. I do see the steps. I do think the last couple games and obviously the skid that they're on right now, it doesn't feel great. But I think each game is bringing a lesson. And I think, even those 2 Nashville games, unfortunate the way they played out, especially at the very ends, but those are lessons that you file under your belt and you hopefully can use in the future.
I think the big takeaway through 50 games last year and 50 games this year is the goal differential, which last year you had 10-1 and 10-2 consecutive losses, getting blown out by Carolina and Florida and Tampa, and which Tampa did again this year. But even the bad losses this year are even a little bit closer. 8-3 to Winnipeg earlier this year, 7-3 to Vegas. I guess the one that stands out is the game in Tampa, but they've just been a more competitive team that's in all the games. And I guess that brings me to the moral victory question, Brody, and the steps along the way. Yes, there are a lot of painful losses still, but should we, as people who are broadcasters for the team, as well as the fan base, be encouraged because we do see the positive aspects of having more competitive losses? I know the team doesn't want to accept that, but I wonder if you and I, as not impartial, but as outside viewers, do we see that as a positive?
Yeah, you mean Ryan Warsofsky doesn't let us in the coach's room and draw up all the plays? No, we're not that inside the team. But actually, it's interesting, Ted, because in one sentence there, you use 2 phrases: moral victory and competitive losses. Now, that's 2 ways to look at it, right? Moral victory makes you feel good, like, well, it was a win in some ways. Competitive loss still identifies that it was a loss,
right?
But at least it was competitive. So, to your point, what I've done in the last couple of years is I have evolved my terminology. It used to be, for me, a couple of years ago, moral victory, because the team was, I think, in a more rock-bottom spot. I think they were still trying to go through the entire restructuring, rebuilding. You can't start building until you demolish what used to be there. And so I think what I used to say was these were moral victories. Last year and into this year, it's competitive losses because I to your point, no player, no coach, no general manager. I mean, they would love to do both things at the same time. They'd love to rebuild and they love to win at the same time. That's hard to do. It's a lot of times near impossible to do. You have to identify it as losses. There's no question about that. I mean, look at Macklin. It was the last game of the road trip, I think. It was the Nashville game. Did he take the iPad at the end and, chucked it off as the team went into the dressing room at Bridgestone Arena? So there is frustration there. There should be frustration there. You do not want to have this culture that's growing and that's maturing. You don't want to have it come up and think that losing is okay. So these are losses, but these are competitive losses. And to your point, the goal differential speaks to that. The eye test speaks to that this year. Things are different. And I mean, even look at, some of the empty netter situations on the last road trip. Every game almost has an empty netter or two that when you look at the final score, like in Boston, it's a total, if you just look at the box score, totally different than how the game played out for, let's say, 47 minutes or 57 minutes even. So I think just watching this season is more important than trying to analyze all the numbers on this season.
The big difference maker to me is the young star factor with Yaroslav Askarov, who looks phenomenal. And I know you talked with Nabby the other day, and he's wowed by his talent. Will Smith, he's maybe not as advanced in his game yet as Macklin Celebrini, but Will Smith to me looks like he's on the right path. And we saw him, in Boston making two great plays where he turned defense into offense. Yeah. And then there's Macklin Celebrini, who, in my opinion, is the first naturally born superstar that the Sharks have had of this talent. And I mean that as no disrespect to a Patrick Marleau or a Joe Pavelski or a Logan Couture, but he does look to be on the next level. And I think that's why, in my opinion, as we watch the Warriors run seemingly come to an end, and I don't want that to come to an end because I enjoy watching Steph Curry so much. I want to see him in big games for as long as is possible. But you've had Barry Bonds, you had the Giants with their mini run. Everyone kind of looked at Tim Lincecum. Now we have the situation with Macklin Celebrini where he could be the Bay Area's next gigantic superstar, because even with the 49ers, they still haven't, even though they had great talents there, they haven't had that one defining superstar that stands above the rest.
Are you trying to diversify my conversation here? Are you trying to take us out of Sharks land and into the Bay Area landscape?
I like this. But that's what Macklin Celebrini does. Yeah. He has that Bay Area broadness.
To your point, and I've thought about this a lot, do people remember Steph Curry the first couple years of his NBA career? I feel like they know about him and they understand that, but they don't really remember him only since maybe 2015 and 16, and finally when it was him and Clay and Draymond, and obviously they got Kevin Durant at a certain, was it 2016 when he joined the team summer? So my point is,
yes, 15-16 summer, yeah.
Steph is well remembered for the more recent times and when the team got good. Nobody really remembers 2011 Steph, do they?
The ankles?
And yeah, well, no, he had a problem, right? He could not stay healthy, and everybody thought, well, this might be a blown pick and a wasted career. Great player, but he can't stay healthy. Now, totally, side story from what we're seeing with Macklin Celebrini, knock on wood. I think the point is Macklin is at where Steph Curry was at. Team that you can kind of see putting things together, stockpiling picks, going in the right direction, got all the right people in place. This is like the Sharks are kind of in the pre-dynasty. Let me say this again. The Sharks are in the Warriors pre-dynasty era of their timeline. Does that make sense? Like, that's a really deep thought. I really think that's where they're at. And they do have what you can see as a generational player that's going to get better, but still is not surrounded by all the pieces that, a good team is built from.
And that takes time. I mean, everybody wants the Sharks to be a finished team yesterday. It's hard to be patient. Yeah. I think to Mike Greer's credit, that's what he's been consistently building is patience. And while we're watching the Sharks this year, once again, seemingly barrel towards what would we assume would be a top pick or right in that category of the top 3-4 picks, depending on where they finish up, that's still probably going to benefit the team long-term, as frustrating as it is. And to your point, I've made the comparison. I remember what the A's were in 1999. I believe that was they're young, but they can play type of modeling. The Warriors, when they first had Steph, Clay, and Draymond and Harrison Barnes, where people were like, hey, they're not good, but they're exciting.
Right.
The Giants in 07-08 when Lincecum and Kane were first coming into the fold, and then Bumgarner and Posey right thereafter. It feels similar to those. And it feels like you're watching those next steps being taken. It's just so hard to be patient. And Mike Greer is being patient, which he has a level of maturity that I do not.
It's hard to be patient, but it's also, I think, in those who judge his moves and trying to understand and comprehend like every small and big thing he does, it's hard for him to be perfect because right now it's almost like a Bob Ross painting, right? When Bob Ross would do a painting and he maybe do a part where it looks like he's messing up and you're like, oh, wait, that splotch of gray over there or green, it wasn't what I was expecting. And then you kind of see what he does with it. And then you kind of see what goes over it. And I think sometimes it is that for watching the moves that Grierzy and the front office make. And you know what? Look, sometimes they're not all going to work out. Like if you look at a batting average, so to speak, of a general manager, obviously it's never going to be 1,000%. So the times that things don't work out, I think that's going to, spark some cause for concern or question or revisiting things. So long as, on the whole, things are moving in the right direction and there is a direction and you can start to see the bigger picture things. I guess my point in that is, even as the trade deadline approaches here, don't read into every small thing as if it's the last thing or the very most important thing. Sometimes you catch a break. Sometimes you get a lot more than you expected. Sometimes it's a wash. And honestly, a few times it's not going to work out your way. But I think, to your point, patience going into understanding that not everything's going to work out, but you hope that most things do. That leads you to progress, and that leads you to where they want to be.
Mario Ferraro, if he is still here, should probably be doing some sort of Bob Ross-esque bit for them because his hair is very impressive these days. You had, as I like to say, actually, during the pandemic, you had the Prince Valiant look. He's got the Bob Ross look.
You know what? When I talked to him about that yesterday, my comment was, I was not familiar with your game. Like, he's always had kind of short hair, and right. I guess I wasn't paying attention to it getting that long. And he's like, no, this is the longest, you're right, that it's ever been. And I was like, well, I guess just under the helmet, I don't know. I just never. And then my other question was, so is this like a 20-minute thing, some blow drying, some curling? And he's like, nope. He's like, when it's super dry, rub my hands through it. I don't even need product. It just does that. So
I swear we can go back to pictures of the Flyers in the 70s, and I would swear that he was playing for them. So I'll have to go and see if we've got a time traveler on our hands. Let's talk about the deadline because you brought us in that direction, which is where I wanted to go. And we saw a couple of names out of Sharks practice yesterday, all of whom have been bandied about as trade deadline names for San Jose. But we look at a Cody Ceci, a Mario Ferraro, a Mikael Granlund, a Luke Cunnin, a Nico Sturm, a Jan Ruda. How many moves can Mike Grier make to where people understand it, or does he not have to worry about what people do or do not understand, especially with a guy like Granlund, who people really like here in San Jose?
Yeah. Well, and that was my point earlier about the things that you don't maybe necessarily understand now that make sense later when the painting gets a little bit more complete. It's my belief, right, that every year you have an idea that the Sharks might make a move. And let's go back, Ted, 10 years ago. Super competitive, trying to push for the playoffs every year. Something was going to happen at or near the deadline, before the deadline, almost every year. That's just kind of the Doug Wilson era. That was kind of the nature of the Sharks. And obviously Doug and Grierzy, two different people and approaches. But I mean, it's almost, right, it's a foregone conclusion that, like, we did this last year, I think, on television. What's the over-under on Sharks players, like NHL roster players that are going to get moved by the Sharks this year? Like, if I said 4, would you think that's a pretty good over-under number right there? Like, it could be close to 4.
I would put it at 3.5 if I was Vegas, but yes.
Well, okay, to the point. So like 3 or 4 players. Now, which one of those is it going to be? Is it going to be somebody you expected? Is it going to be somebody totally off the radar? My feeling on this is that, and especially with the Rantanen deal yesterday, that the deadline isn't what it used to be. I mean, you want to get a good deal, but if you can get a player earlier than later, I mean, don't even be surprised. Are we 6 weeks away, 6 weeks away from the deadline?
Yeah, March 7th, I believe, March 6th, March 7th.
So it's still a ways away, but let's also include anything that happens, I don't know, next week, 2 weeks from now. Let's include that as part of the deadline. I know we're all in hockey mode where, deadline day is the deadline and that's it. But I think it's a more long-term approach of what the Sharks are doing. So I don't see them as waiting to the last minute. They kind of know what they want to do, right? Other teams are still jockeying and they want to play it out as long as they can because they're not sure are we a playoff team or not. The Sharks don't really have that issue, question, or concern. So let's look at it from an earlier perspective. In terms of those names you mentioned too, I also find it interesting that the Sharks kind of have to prepare those players for being trade ready. And by that, I mean, you obviously don't want anybody to get hurt, right? But you want those players to be well rested and performing and kind of platforming themselves over the next couple weeks so that if they are on the table, they have every opportunity to play their best, get seen, and potentially be moved for something the Sharks want in return. And I've
Brody,
always
you say
hated-
that like you and I have a long-term history of being A's fans or something.
You got to platform your players. And you know what? And I always hate talking about these hockey players as property,
Right.
and not people. But I think they all understand it's the nature of it. And you know what? For some of them, if Mikhail Granlund is going to the playoffs this year, good. And if the Sharks get something tremendous in return, good for both parties. I mean, look, go back to the Timo Meier trade, right?
Right.
At the time, you're like, well, it's Timo, and okay, well, Timo's on a good team. The Sharks got a bunch of pieces back, so again, it all works out.
It all works out, and that's the thing is I hate the who won the trade, and I'm always of the mind of, well, both parties can win a trade. Just as a quick one, somebody said the yesterday's trade, the three-way trade, was the biggest since Jumbo. Do you agree with that? Or I can't even, it's so short term that I don't even know if I can put that together. Also, what did Chicago get out of this? Is this my other take is like, is this we'll help your trade so you can be a gentleman's non-agreement of you'll help us with a trade later?
Yeah, I think Chicago could have got more off of Taylor Hall than just, would they get a pick, a third round pick?
Third rounder, yeah.
Yeah, I did not. They were a bystander of the whole deal. They were a facilitator. Why even have it be a 3-team trade? What were you doing as part of this? There must have been some
a wink and a nod.
Middleman exchange, some money laundering. No, I don't know what they were doing in the middle of all that. It doesn't make a lot of sense. To your point, maybe the biggest trade, like just because Rantanen's name is in it, I guess.
Yeah.
It's hard. That's a hard one, but yeah, I didn't really understand that. But to the point, I mean, look, we're not even in February yet, and that type of deal was made a couple years ago. That is only a deadline day blockbuster shocker. So there you go. I mean, that's the new NHL. Nobody wants to wait. If you can do this now, do this now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Colorado, they traded for Wedgwood, they traded for Blackwood,
right,
and now they've traded for Netchas. So they're clearly impatient. They want to maximize their window. Two guys like us who were here for the entirety of the Doug Wilson era, we know exactly what that was like. As a final one for you in these next two games, as they're going up against Florida, whose window is still wide open, and then against
Pittsburgh. They good last year? Was Florida good last year?
I think they were just a little bit.
Yeah,
but then
do some
Pittsburgh
research on that.
Yeah, well, Pittsburgh's at the end. This
right.
Fire sale talk is going on. It's pretty wild to go up against two teams that are at complete opposite ends of the spectrum, but both of which who still have some of the biggest and best names in the NHL.
Yeah, and I mean, Florida's obviously, to your point, wanting to hang on to them and try and win another Stanley Cup. And if you're the Penguins, it's almost to the point where you got Sidney Crosby and you love Sidney Crosby and you love to have the story be written that he was a Penguin forever, start to finish. But I mean, if you are going to unload Erik Karlsson and others, and if this is the breaking up, if they're kind of a couple years behind what the Sharks ultimately did.
Hey, wait, Brody, are you talking about Sidney Crosby and the Penguins, or are you talking about Steph Curry and the Warriors?
It's kind of the same situation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like a team that had its run, had its day, and now has a legacy superstar with still something in the tank, right?
Yeah,
now, if Sid and Steph were players that you're like, all right, you can just kind of send them, to the professional sports retirement home, then that wouldn't be a story here, and it would kind of be a non-issue. But they can still play, they can still contribute, they can still bring a lot to the game, the sport, and the league. So I don't know. To your point, I think the next two games are polar opposites. It's nice to see the Sharks home on a span here of, 6 out of 7, so now 5 out of 6. They needed that, especially going into the break, just that one game road trip to Seattle before the Four Nations break. And you and I can look at Sharks decades past and say, well, here's the easy part of the schedule. There is no more easy part of the Sharks schedule. Every opponent to them is difficult, and they always have been, but the matchups are more difficult. So it never gets easier. I think, obviously, to break the skid they're on right now is important. You don't want to have these sustained, 9 games to start the year like they did, or a 7-game skid that they had at the end of 2024. I think that if we can start eliminating things out of their game, like the blowout losses, I think the next thing to eliminate are these sustained periods of losing, right? If you can get those things away, those are steps forward to becoming a 500-type hockey team, a more competitive hockey team, and ultimately the next step closer to where you want to be.
8-6-2 with a lead entering the third period.
Oh.
You want to be a winning team in the NHL, you've got to take big strides to improve that record.
Yeah.
So, well, Brody, I know you're in a hurry to go clean your garage, so I will let you get to that.
It's a game day, so it is a game day, and I want to get a few things done before I get to the fun work tonight. But there's just a few responsibilities, Ted. I know you know how that goes.
Yes, I know. They're barking at me literally and yelling at me literally on the other side of the door, so I got to go deal with it as well. But thank you for your time, Brody. Unfortunately, I will not be at the tank tonight, but I will be eagerly looking forward to your Brody's breakdown after the game. I almost said Brody's breakaway, but no, that's more of the dream you had when you were 12 years old, being on the breakaway, going up against maybe Nabby individually, but it'll be Brody's breakdown.
I'm older than that. It was Urbe. Come on.
Okay, well, that's true. Yeah. But I was just thinking of the one maybe that's the larger name. But
Good point.
yeah.
Good point. Thank you so much, Ted. I appreciate it.
All right, Brody. Be good.